things before I sort of jump into this. First off, thank you very much to the program for bringing me down to talk. I'm a Duke Ph.D. and through deft travel planning yesterday I was able to see the Duke Baylor game in a bar in the Atlanta airport with myself and about 74 Baylor fans who were not terribly happy about either my presence or the outcome of the game. On a more serious note, I wanted to give a bit of a disclaimer before I started. Unfortunately, a lot of what I do in this is looking at the language and discussions around the issue of military actions in the Philippine War, and a lot of that language uses racially unpleasant words. So I'm going to be throwing around a fair number of racial epithets during my talk. They are all quotes from contemporaneous sources, and because I'm trying to look at perceptions of race in the Philippines, they are absolutely essential. But I apologize in advance, and I'll try to keep it to a minimum. Let me tell you two stories by way of starting this off, to give you a sense of the complicated nature and the complicated interactions between Southern culture and what was going on in the Philippines between 1899 and 1902. First is about a gentleman by the name of Joseph Wheeler. Fighting Joe Wheeler was what his nickname, and he was a West Point graduate in 1859, fought for the Confederates during the Civil War, and then after the war was over, retired involuntarily, obviously, and did a number of things as a civilian before the Spanish-American War broke out. When it did, in 1898, he volunteered for the United States Army and served in both the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War as a general in the U.S. Army. And when Longstreet saw him in the uniform of the James Longstreet, the former Confederate general, saw him in that uniform in 1902, he told Joe Wheeler that he hoped that he, James Longstreet, would die before Wheeler did, so he could be in heaven when Jubal Early saw Joe Wheeler in the blue uniform of the Union. But in the Philippines, he had a bit of a problem. Well, both in the Spanish-American War and the Philippines, he had a bit of a problem. He kept getting the enemy wrong. He kept, so the story goes, he kept charging with his unit enemy entrenchments, screaming, "Come on, boys, we've got those Yankees on the run." And in fact, as the story goes, at one point his men took him aside to remind him that they were fighting Filipinos rather than Northerners. A correction I think he took in stride, but perhaps without particular attention. So that's the first story, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The second story is about the arrival of an African-American unit in the Philippines in late 1899. And according to the Army-Navy Journal, the following happened. And this is a quote from the Army-Navy Journal of 1899. "The appearance of the stalwart Negro regiment was a surprise to the Western volunteers, because they had been isolated to such an extent that the arrival of the 25th had not been heralded. However, one smart volunteer shouted to a tall Negro giant, 'Didn't know you'd come. What do you think you're going to do over here?' The big Negro replied," and the dialect is in the original, "Well, I don't know, but I rather reckon we're sent over here to take up the white man's burden." Now, I love both of those stories, and I'm not going to testify that either of them are true. They're awfully convenient in a lot of ways. And Joe Wheeler was supposed to have yelled that out about the Yankees in both in Cuba where he served and in the Philippines. But they are indicative of the complicated interaction between Southern culture and what was going on in the Philippine-American War. And if you note, one of the critical things about these is the ambiguity of both of those stories. The Wheeler story is about a sort of unregenerate Civil War veteran losing where he is, but it's told as a light, humorous story. It doesn't raise the same passions. It didn't raise the same passions at the end of the 19th century as it would have in 1866 or 67. And even Longstreet's comment is much more about, is much more humorous than it is serious. And the story about the African-American regiment, despite the fact that it's reported that the African-American soldier is speaking in a sort of simplistic dialect, he gets the shot. He's the one who gets the telling blow in. And so, one of the things I want to suggest is that while racism and Southern culture and all sorts of, and memories of the Civil War played into each other in the Philippines at the end of the 19th century, they did so in a very complicated and ambiguous way. It wasn't as simple as there being, as Americans, both Northern and Southern, treating Filipinos in certain specific racial ways. It was that there was this interaction going on. And so what I'd like to do today is spend my time tracing the way in which the, what Don Higginbotham has called the Southern way of war played out in the Philippine Islands during those 3 years of sustained conflict. And let me suggest 3 ways in which this was true. Don Higginbotham wrote, I'm going to steal his quote, "It has long been claimed that Southerners were more enamored of soldiering, were more warlike, and hence were more willing to fight for their principles than were Yankees in 1861. And I think that that sense, that idea, that Southerners were, for whatever reasons at the beginning of the Civil War, were more effective and motivated soldiers, has remained with us to this day. And without going too deeply into the historiography of this, I'd like to suggest that part of this is myth. Part of this is true, depending on how you measure it. But that it was certainly believed, and believed most particularly after 1865 by the Southerners themselves. But there's a problem for the Southerners after 1865, because they lost the Civil War. And so the question for a lot of them becomes, a lot of Southern, especially Southern military men, becomes how do you recover that? How do you reconcile that? If you're more effective martially, how do you recover from the fact that in 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant? The Southerners had something to prove. A lot of Southerners felt that they had something to prove post-1865. And the best way to prove that, 1865, did not mean what it seemed to mean. And the best way to reintegrate themselves into the American nation was to show martial virtue, to show that they were good, that they were superior on the battlefield in the wars, in the American wars that followed. In 1898, a Southern observer spoke of Southern men fighting in the Spanish-American War, and he said, "Bravely did they bear aloft the banner of our country. They followed whenever they were called upon to go, and the best and noblest spirits of which this country could boast have been offered up on the altar of their country." They were patriotic Americans, and they showed it by fighting. They demonstrated it by fighting. But they're not the only ones who are attempting to demonstrate that they were good citizens through military service. Because African Americans in the late 19th century, also, a fair number of African Americans in the late 19th century, also saw military service as a way of showing themselves to be good citizens. If you are a oppressed and discriminated against minority, if you, especially after the end of Reconstruction in the late 1870s, if you are being restricted around by Jim Crow and other similar structures, one of the ways you can demonstrate that you are truly a valorous citizen of your country is through military service. And so we end up with this very strange conjunction of white Southerners trying to recover from the Civil War through military service, and black Southerners doing the same thing. Military martial virtue as a way of demonstrating patriotism and citizenship. And because of that, in many ways, I would suggest to you that the Philippine-American War had had three main characteristics that exemplify what I'm talking about. And I'll just mention them briefly before I go on and talk about them. The racial structures, both in the Philippines and that were imported by the Americans, is one of them. The way in which the Philippine War became in some senses, a refighting of the American Civil War. And most importantly, and the main focus of my talk, the way in which African Americans in the Philippines saw themselves in a terribly complicated and ambiguous position in their military service. Before I go into those, let me give you some background very quickly. In the run-up, let me suggest that the main story of the run-up to the late 1890s that feeds into both the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War is the emergence of the United States as a global power. Or at least I'm going to insist that it is for the moment. You can throw things at me during the question and answer session. Things like that. Heather's nodding at me, so now I'm getting a little nervous. United States came out of the Civil War with both the largest and most advanced navy in the world, and one of the largest and most powerful armies in the world, shockingly enough. In 1865, there were 1 million men under arms in the Union Army, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly. And when the French started interfering in Mexico, installing Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico, and the Americans essentially said, "Go home," the French did. The largest navy in the world, although perhaps not one to rival the British Navy, was still certainly as powerful as any other navy in the world. And having said that, both of those things went away very quickly. In 1865, the United States Navy had more than 600 warships of all types. In early 1870, that number had dropped to under 100 and was still shrinking. The Army, which had been 1 million men in 1865, was down by 1875 to 25,000 soldiers, enough that at a party, a colonel of the Army met up with a woman who, when he was introduced to her, said the following: "What, a colonel of the Army? I suppose the Army was all disbanded at the close of the war." He did not record his response, although I suppose punching her in the face would have been a reasonable idea. Now this leads to all kinds of bizarre situations. Arthur MacArthur, who will reappear in this story, at the end of the Civil War, had been a brevet lieutenant colonel. When the war ended, he remained in the Army, but he was reduced to his permanent rank because all of these, his promotion to lieutenant colonel had been sort of acting. His permanent rank of first lieutenant. He went from being a brevet lieutenant colonel to being a first lieutenant. And he was promoted to captain within 3 years and remained at that rank for the following 23 years. There was no place for him to go because everybody above him was the same age as he was. They had all come into the Army in the Civil War, and those who had remained at whatever ranks they were weren't retiring anytime soon. The only way to gain advancement in the post-Civil War Army was if the guy who ranked above you got killed. When George Custer and his unit got slaughtered at Little Bighorn, it caused the greatest wave of promotion in the U.S. Army in decades as people moved up the ranks to replace him. I'm not sure Custer particularly had that in mind when he did it, but that's how it worked out. In 1893, to give you an example, the average captain was only 4 years younger than the average general. By the time the general retires, the captain's about to retire, so there's no place to go. Some kind of modernization did start before I get to that. The mission of that small army in the later years of the 19th century was to fight wars against Native Americans in the West. They were scattered in small forts around the country. Terrible pay and conditions, heavy drinking was the norm. George Marshall reported that when he got to his first assignment in the West, the unit there had been on a 5-day drinking binge with no let-up in sight. 1/7, between 1867 and 1891, 1/7 of the American Army deserted every year. 1/7 every year. 1890 saw some modernization and professionalization. William Sherman, when he rose to the head of the American Army, cut the number of forts, created advanced schools, including one at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. When someone pointed out the irony of creating an advanced school of military thought at a prison, Sherman did not laugh. But when the Spanish-American War broke out, the Army was still very much a small 19th century force. The Navy, by contrast, had become much more modern. The American economy was growing and industrializing. Giant steam steel warships were being built for it. The Navy seemed the modern service, machines and shiny metal and large guns. The Army seemed to be the sort of background, the unimportant service. An impression that was added to in the Spanish-American War when reports about the appalling conditions in Tampa and other places in Florida started leaking out to the newspapers, showing the Army incapable of even what seemed to be a small war. And much to their surprise, it was this Army that ended up with the Philippine Islands in early 1899. President William McKinley hadn't really known what to do with the islands when Dewey won the battle in Manila Bay. He thought about giving them their independence. He thought about taking just Manila Bay as a port for the Navy. But in the end, he decided to take the Philippines, and he began to send units of the Army out to the Philippines to conquer from the Spanish. On their way out, and this is a complete non sequitur story, but I have to tell it, it's such a great one. They stop off at Guam, which is a Spanish possession, and they fire, the fleet full of battleship, of cruisers and troop ships, fires a warning shot at the Spanish fort to get them to surrender. And the Spanish commander rows out in a canoe, very apologetic because he doesn't have any guns in his fort to fire a return salute of honor, which is what he thinks this is. And the American commander very kindly explains what's going on, Guam has not gotten any news from Spain in over a year, so he doesn't know they're at war with the United States. And he very kindly surrenders Guam to us, which is how we acquired Guam in this process. A lot of people knew what we should do with the Philippines. Rudyard Kipling, for example, wrote a poem about what we should do with the Philippines. "Take up the white man's burden," he said. "Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best you breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." And I mention that because I want to highlight that from the very beginning, the Philippines was explicitly a racial war. A war in which race was a lens used to see what was going on, to organize how things were done, and to try to influence. And a racial war on both northern and southern parts. Southerners were not peculiar to this viewpoint. But I want to note something else before I talk about how those racial visions played out. The Philippines was already organized racially. We didn't impose, the American forces didn't impose a racial vision on the Philippines. It was already there. And so what happens is not just that we bring the racism with us or the racial structures with us and build them in the Philippines. It's that there are already racial structures there that we react to. And what ends up in the Philippines is an interaction, a negotiation between those racial structures. In the Philippines, you were supreme. You were of the highest level if you were a Spaniard born in Spain. A peninsularian is what they call it. You were still superior, but of second rank, if you were of Spanish descent, but born in the Philippines. Insulares. The native Filipinos themselves were the lowest level. Indios, they were called. And they were very much seen as deeply inferior beings. One Spanish Catholic priest said, "The monkey will always be a monkey, however you dress him, with shirt and trousers." And that was how the Spanish viewed the native Filipinos. But with us, Americans brought racial visions of their own. And more than one. For example, one of the racial visions brought was what I would refer to as a Western one. Filipino women, usually, frequently the mistresses of American soldiers, were often referred to as squaws, as Native American women. And that analysis, that vision was very much of a Western one. Sometimes explicitly. One American soldier said of the Filipinos, "They are only semi-civilized," quote, "they are only semi-civilized and wear no clothes, only a G-string. The women wear a little apron about 3 inches square in front, and of course they are a sight. But of all that, they are the most moral people I ever saw. Our civilized brethren and sisters in the States could learn something in that line. They are something like our North American Indian. The women do most of the work. The men lie around and smoke." Sounds okay, kind of good to me. Somewhere my wife is about to throw something at me, so I will move on quickly before I get into more trouble. So that's one vision. Second vision is what you might be expecting, very explicitly Southern vision of race. Both Northern and Southern soldiers started using language about the Filipinos that explicitly connected them with American blacks as soon as they got to the Philippines. One British observer said, quote, "I feel sorry for the Filipinos and all that have come under control of the United States. I don't believe that they will be justly dealt by. The first thing in the morning is nigger, and the last thing at night is nigger." They are beginning to learn what nigger means. Now, here's where it gets bizarre. I said this was complicated and ambiguous, and here's one of the examples. Northern soldiers and Northern officers would quite freely throw around the N-word when talking about Filipinos. One of the groups that protested were African-American soldiers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But another group that protested were Southern officers. And the logic was the following. We are socializing with Filipinos of Spanish descent. But you don't socialize with blacks back at home, so don't call them that word, because then we can't socialize with them. They're caught in the language of Jim Crow. If you call somebody we socialize with by that word, you're telling us we're committing a grave social error. Because African Americans aren't allowed in our houses back home, and we're letting them in our houses here. I mean, think about that for a second. The racial frame that they're bringing with them isn't quite fitting, and they don't quite know what to do with it at this point. All right, so that's the first thing, racial structures that came with that. Second thing, and I'll spend a little bit, I won't spend as much time on this one because this is farther off, but the way in which the Philippine-American War echoed elements of refighting the Civil War. And there are two things that I would highlight in this. First, the structure that guided how American soldiers fought in the Civil War, in the Philippine War, had been written in the Civil War. General Order 100, which guided how American soldiers dealt with guerrilla warfare, with insurgent warfare, was written by a lawyer named Francis Lieber during the Civil War, who had two sons, one fighting for the Union and one fighting for the Confederates. And so he wrote the General Order in a very even-handed way because he didn't want either one of his sons hurt in such a conflict. The Civil War, and the same thing comes down to the Philippine-American War, this sense of both insurgents and counterinsurgents as having a claim to some kind of morality. Because the Civil War was brother against brother, or at least the sort of perception of it was. And that sense came down to the Philippine War. The second way that this became true was in the tactics that American officers used. Many of these American officers, Southern and Northern, had been in the Civil War. They knew, above all, that mounting a frontal assault against a defended position was a disastrously bad idea. What they discovered in the Philippine War, however, was that exactly the reverse was the case. And I won't really go into the reasons in too much detail, but it turned out very quickly that mounting a frontal assault against Filipino insurgents was actually the best thing to do, rather than the worst. And so, unlike with Francis Lieber and General Order 100, there was this shock on the part of the American officer corps that this was a war different than they understood. This was a war not like the Civil War. Third, let me turn to the particular focus of this talk, the situation of African American Southerners in the Philippine-American War. There were a number of African American regiments in the Philippines: the 24th and 25th U.S. Infantry, 10th Cavalry, the 48th and 49th Volunteer regiments at various times. The Filipinos referred to them as the Soldados Negros when they arrived over there. And African Americans had a complicated reaction to their situation in the Philippines. The civilian African American community saw this as an unalloyed evil on the part of the United States. The Richmond Planet, an African-American newspaper, said in 1899, quote, "With the government acquiescing in the oppression and butchery of a dark race in this country and the enslaving and slaughtering of a dark race in the Philippines, we think it is time to call all missionaries home and have them work on our own people." Booker T. Washington echoed the same sentiment the next year. Quote, "The Philippine Islands should be given an opportunity to govern themselves. Until our nation has settled the Negro and Indian problems, I do not believe that we have a right to assume more social problems." And H.T. Johnson, clergyman and journalist in Atlanta, wrote in 1901, in an obvious parody of Kipling, "Pile on the black man's burden, his wail with laughter drowned. You've sealed the red man's problem, and will take up the brown. In vain you seek to end it with bullets, blood, or death. Better by far defend it with honor's holy breath." For African American soldiers, though, it's a lot more complicated and problematic. Some of them echoed the civilian issues. African American sergeant by the name of John Calloway said that he and his African American comrades were, quote, "between the devil and the deep sea" in the Philippines. He was constantly haunted, he said, by the feeling of how wrong morally Americans are in the present affair. The Filipinos actually tried to take advantage of this. Filipino leader Emilio Aguinaldo put out propaganda that cited African-American lynchings back in the United States as a reason that African-American soldiers shouldn't support what Americans were doing. Mention a man named Sam Hose, who had been lynched in Georgia in 1899. Explicitly. The problem was that African-American soldiers in the Philippines didn't necessarily agree with either Calloway or Washington or the other protests back home. They shared with their brethren, the white soldiers, the feeling that the Filipino population was hostile and arrayed against them. Many of them did. The regimental diary of the 10th Cavalry remarked in May of 1901 upon arriving on the Filipino island of Samar that the soldiers found many Samaritans but not any good ones. And there is this sense of the difficulty of fighting a war against people who may seem to be in your situation, but who are actively fighting against you. It's difficult to reconcile the two. It became even more difficult when African American soldiers started relationships with Native women. Now they were tangled up in emotional relationships, as soldiers frequently are, with Native Filipino women, and what their relationship, what their responsibility to those women, as well as to the Filipinos themselves, was an extremely difficult question to answer. Some deserted. 29 African American soldiers deserted during the Philippine-American War out of about 5,000 who served. Most famous of these is a soldier by the name of David Fagan. He deserted the 24th Infantry Regiment. He deserted in November of 1899. He was given a commission in Aguinaldo's army and started writing insulting letters to General Frederick Funston of the American forces. He became front page news back in the United States, at least in the white papers. The African American papers, for the most part, ignored him. And
And the sense here is that they don't quite know how to react to that. They sympathize with, perhaps with his viewpoint, but at the same time, they're having trouble handling going over to the other side. And so they essentially ignore the story for most of the year. Funston, by the way, becomes obsessed with Fagin and spends over a year chasing him, at one point sending out a reward, putting out a reward of about $1,000, which was real money in those days, for his body, for Fagin, dead or alive. At Christmas, his sister-in-law poked him and said, "By Jiminy Christmas bread, what's this I see? Poor old Fagin hanged on a tree?" And he got up and left the dinner table. He was not apparently a good sport about it. In December of 1901, Fagin's head was brought in, or what a Filipino claimed was Fagin's head, and the Filipino received a reward. On news of his death, the Indianapolis Freeman, an African-American paper, wrote, and this sort of epitomizes the sense of ambiguity: "Fagin was a traitor and died a traitor's death, but he was a man no doubt prompted by honest motives to help a weakened side, and one he felt allied to by bonds that bind." And finally, let me suggest something else. The difficulty for African-American soldiers was that fighting in the Philippines caused problems with a lot of their motivation for entering the service itself. If they are attempting through martial virtue to demonstrate their good citizenship, at least as part of their service, then reacting to what's going on in the Philippines undercuts that. If they desert or ally themselves or protest with the Filipinos, they are shortcutting their own goal. And they can't claim that good citizenship. They were proud of their service. A number of soldiers, and I'll quote one in a second, a number of soldiers spoke about how doing their duty earned them something. Earned them something as Americans. When an African-American soldier on leave was attacked by a white civilian who apparently didn't like something he was doing, he essentially, at the trial, he said, "We did our duty. We don't think," and this is still the quote, "we don't think we should be insulted because we're black. We did our duty." And thinking about the Filipino situation made it hard to do that duty. And so and I would suggest that this was the reaction of most of the African-American soldiers, tried to ignore the situation as much as possible. And I'll give you a couple of quotes to illustrate what I mean by that. A sergeant in the 10th Cavalry, quote, "All enemies of the U.S. government look alike. Hence we go along with the killing just as with other people." A private in the 24th, quote, "Our oaths of allegiance know neither race, color, nor nation." I misquoted him, he's calling to protest. A corporal in the 48th, quote, "Whether it is right to reduce the Filipinos to submission is not a question for the soldier to decide. Our oath of," and he echoes this, "our oath of allegiance does not know race, and if such a question should arise, it would be disposed of as one of a political nature by a soldier." We don't want to think about this. We don't have to think about this. But there's one other way in which African American soldiers interacted with the situation and with the Filipinos. In a sense, if they were subalterns at home, if they were members of an oppressed and restricted group at home. In the Philippines, they had a chance to become what I would call, become imperialists, essentially. Because many African American soldiers remained in the Philippines after their service and settled there, either by themselves or with their native mistresses. Eventually, most of them married native Filipinos. The Philippines were particularly attractive. It was a colored society in which African Americans were, by virtue of their American status, at a top rank. Their army pensions gave them an economic position in the Philippines that they could not match at home, and so many of them stayed. William Blakeney, a soldier in the 25th, wrote home to say, "In this country will many fortunes made. Why not come and share with us the glorious good times which are sure to come? Come now," he ended. On a side note, 2 of those African American soldiers, according to Ebony magazine, were still alive in 1972, living in the Philippines. And I highlight that because I want to again point out the complicated nature of all of this. Many of them feel compassion, African Americans feel compassion for the Filipinos, but that compassion comes at some cost to them, potentially, if they allow it to manifest. And in addition, living in the Philippines offers them the kind of status that they could never get at home, both economically and socially. And so in a sense, the temptations of living in the Philippines is one that was hard to resist for many. And finally, to manifest sympathy for the Filipinos too strongly undercut the very reason why many of them were in the army to begin with. Undercut what they were trying to demonstrate, which is that soldierly virtue. Let me finish up today by mentioning 2 final things. African American soldiers were not the only ones who noted the Philippines as a potential place for African Americans. Theodore Roosevelt thought at one moment in 1903 that the Philippines could be a place to answer what he called the Negro question. That the African American population of the United States could be resettled in the Philippines. And he in fact sent an emissary to see if that would work. The report said it would, but shockingly, African Americans in the United States, for the most part, did not share the idea of this as a solution to the Negro question, as Roosevelt had put it. And then, second, and really finally, in one of the strange ironies, after the Philippine War was over, Filipinos emerged in a strange way as rivals, racial rivals to African Americans in the American system. I'll highlight what I mean by that. It's a little strange, but I'll highlight what I mean by that by telling you a story about the U.S. Navy. 1923, U.S. Navy decides to get rid of all African Americans in the Navy. They'd come in because of World War I, and the powers that be in the Navy decide they don't like African Americans on their ships. They're going to get rid of them. But they still need mess servants. You don't want white people serving food at the dinner. So who do they get? Filipinos. And that's the root of what is still a very heavily Filipino group within the U.S. Navy, was as replacements for African Americans. They were, to a certain extent, perceived as a favored race for African Americans. And finally, and really to wrap things up, let me leave you with the suggestion, the larger suggestion, that wars like the Civil War and like the Filipino War rarely end when the fighting stops. That they become cultural legacies. That as the Civil War affected African Americans and Southerners in the Philippine-American War, continue to affect people for decades after the final battle or final surrender. Thank you very much for your attention.